One day, the blessed land of Chiron declared a holy war. The black-eyed demons of Iphon and the witches of Tempe, who controlled the animals with sorcery, who surpassed humans in power, went on a rampage. Since it was becoming impossible to cope with the chaos that was taking place in the real world, a true saint was needed, who would be freed from the passage of time. Blessed by God himself, with an ageless body and unfading beauty. This is what the high priest of Chiron said, as well as the fact that only the believers of Chiron had received the sacred power of God. This was confirmed by the blue flame, the blue breath of God, which would judge the heretics of the earth. The high priest was pleased with the results that investigator Manhwa had been able to achieve against the demons of Iphon, but it was not enough for him. Despite the fact that the knight was popularly dubbed the strongest divine mace of Chiron, he was not yet able to get rid of the Tempe witches. Unlike the demons of Iphon, who relied on physical superiority and rushed into battle without a second thought, the witches were individually weak and fled the battlefield, hiding, using the terrain of Tempe. Finding absolutely every place they hid was quite difficult. But today, the high priest was ordering him to find one in particular. The great witch with eyes as red as blood. She was the leader of the witches, creatures who controlled beasts, and colored good souls with evil. A well-known strategy. It's worth chopping off the head and the torso will disappear on its own. But Manhwa had to be extremely careful, because it was said that the red eyes of the older witch bewitch with a single look, and the high priest did not want to lose such a reliable servant of God. The investigator frankly did not believe in this nonsense, but kept his opinion to himself. The search for Manhwa was not successful for a long time. The witches, who had never been trained, were quick to hide and run away, just like rats. Perhaps because of the great witch's power, but the fact remained. The cleansing party moved further southwest. The young witch doubted it was safe to stay in one place, provided the witches were being burned alive in the valley nearby. They could be found. The red-eyed girl especially did not react in any way to this sensible remark, and the girl was meanwhile being dragged outside. The other, older witches didn't like that she was questioning the words of Bieni the Great Witch. They were sure that she could not betray them because she was such a creature. The witch didn't have time to finish her sentence as she was overtaken by a knight's blade. Wherever the witches tried to run, there were soldiers everywhere. The Great Witch had left them to their doom. By Maclath's order, all the girls had their eyes checked, looking for the red-eyed one. A girl was pushed to the knight's feet. The irises of her eyes were full of blood. The man immediately remembered the words of the high priest about the magical power of these eyes, capable of bewitching. A blue flame flickered between them. Maclath had finally found the great red-eyed witch. The Great Witch was kept in the walls of the fortress of Rave, near Tempe on the state border of Chiron. There, the girl was blindfolded and tortured in a vain attempt to get some useful information out of her. This was because Maclath saw something very strange in the ease with which they had caught the famed Great Witch. But the knights could not find anything special in the girl, despite their best efforts. From the temple, however, word came that the high priest's trusted man was to arrive at dawn and transport the captive to the capital. Maclath, having heard the report, let his subordinate go, but he hesitated for a moment and told him something else. On the day they had caught the Great Witch, she had stood on a hill and laughed gleefully, looking at her burning tribesmen. Later, the red-eyed girl had tried to say something to Maclath, but she hadn't been able to make any sense out of it. The knight could not understand what she was up to. The next day, early in the morning, there was a commotion among the inhabitants of the fortress. The high priest's confidant appeared at the gate. He was carrying a paper stating that the Great Witch was to be brought to the capital and executed. Dr. Pepin Toth, the high priest's authorized physician, was responsible for the transportation. His face was concealed by a white mask. The witch, meanwhile, was led out into the courtyard. There was no blindfold over her eyes because, as the servants explained, Pepin wanted to see the red eyes in person. The girl looked around and muttered something. The dogs suddenly snapped off their chains and fiercely attacked their own masters. The witch managed to snatch the chain from the escort's hands and run, but the road was blocked by Maya Clat. He dropped his hand to the hilt of his sword, drawing it from its sheath. Escape was a senseless and dangerous idea. However, the high priest's doctor, noticing the investigator's gesture, immediately warned that injuring the Great Witch was in no way allowed. The soldiers quickly oriented themselves and grabbed the girl by the scruff of her neck, pulling her back. She suddenly shouted that she would help Mayclad in destroying the witches, shocking everyone. Mayclad froze and frowned, puzzled, when the Great Witch suddenly offered to help destroy her own tribeswomen. The knight holding her by her shirt jerked the girl back again and dragged her towards the transportation cage. But suddenly, Mayclad ordered a halt and demanded proof from the witch. The people around them were dumbfounded by the question, but the man had little interest in their opinion. He looked at the girl. She told them to go to the Gavon forest, where she said was the home of the strongest witches. It was only a day's journey to the forest, and Maya Clath ordered that scouts be sent there, and the witch be thrown back into the dungeon until the truth of the tip was confirmed. At the council, along with the priests, an argument broke out. The clergy were adamantly opposed to trusting the Great Witch. They saw her words as a desperate attempt to save her own skin, and even if she did know something, the priests feared the consequences. Maklat listened to their outrage with enviable equanimity. A subordinate approached him and reported that the story told in the fortress was true. Maklat's patience ran out when the priest carelessly suggested that perhaps the investigator had already been affected by the magic of the red-eyed witch. Then the man lowered the witch's severed head wrapped in rags onto the table. The priest fell silent in surprise, but Maklath spoke. It took 3 years to completely destroy the demons of Ifon. The longer the war went on, the more damage was done to the troops and the hinterlands. Maklat was only willing to reverse his decision if the priest had some other idea on how to shorten the war. But if they just didn't like it, he suggested the church representatives go to the battlefield themselves in that case. Of course, Maklat wasn't going to let the witch stay alive forever, just as long as she would be useful. He asked Dr. Pepin to submit a request for a temporary pardon to the high priest to determine the red-eyed girl's usefulness. As conclusive results to the high priest, Mayaklat pledged to burn half of Tempe in 6 months. For 6 months, the Great Witch was kept blindfolded in the dungeon. When it was time to come out, a knight who came in roughly hauled her to her feet, grabbed her by the shoulder, and dragged her out into the hallway. He asked Mayklath where he should take the prisoner, but he decided to do it himself. In the study, the Great Witch was waiting for an interrogation from Maya Clay. He wondered if the witch had any idea why exactly she had been brought to this room. There were only half of the witches in the place she had named last time. Was the red-eyed girl so desperate that she had decided to say so? Or was this a ploy to help the witches? The Great Witch shook her head. If things were as the investigator had suggested, then why would Bieni say anything at all, much less the whereabouts of the other witches? At that, the captive was visibly nervous. A fine tremor was beating her. Maklate ordered the girl to take 5 steps forward. She could not disobey and hesitantly began to walk forward. The investigator stepped away from the table and ripped the blindfold off the witch's eyes. In 6 months, more than half of Tempe will be burned, Maklat was saying, and now a map of Tempe dotted with red crosses flashed behind his back. The Great Witch, not giving herself time to be frightened, walked over to the map and pointed her finger to the next spot. Suddenly, Mayclate called out her name, Bieni. That was the name the witches shouted out while they were being killed. The girl bit her lip. Just recently, before she had told her where the witches were hiding, this man had been indifferent to her plight. So why did he suddenly want to know the captive's name? Therefore, squeezing out her words forcefully, she said that Mr. Investigator didn't need to know the name. By doing so, she did not confirm that the name given was hers, but she did not deny it either. They returned to the case. The next location was the Valley of Glad. The witches were hiding near the cliff. If they were hiding in the forest, they would go there. Mayaklat questioned those words. It had been a long time since the Great Witch had left her tribeswomen behind. If they were smart, would they stick to their old habits? Bieni only said that devil, worshipping people were fools. But Maklat did not relent. What if this time it would not be like in the Gawan forest? Then all the knowledge of the red-eyed girl would be useless. She herself would be useless. The witch jerked violently in an attempt to deny the man's words. She assured him that it was exactly as she said. In her excitement, Bieni didn't even notice that she had stepped on the chain, causing her to run into Maclath. He remained unfazed and, barely catching the girl, roughly pushed her back against the wall. Where did the witch get such confidence in her words? Did she have a way of communicating with tribeswomen while in a prison cell? Maklat needed answers no matter how hard he hunted witches. As long as their leader lived, they would not be exterminated. The girl's heart raced in her chest. The faceless images of all the witches appeared before her eyes. They were calling her by name, pulling their vile hands and telling her that Bieni could never escape them. This brief vision made the girl hastily tell Maklat that if he heeded her words, he could destroy all the witches. And someday the sacred blue flames will also scorch Bieni's body until only ashes remain. But right now, she doesn't want to die. Mayaklath watched the captive's face carefully and nodded. He called a subordinate into the room and told him to take the witch to the room. The girl screamed, asked to wait, to answer where they were taking her, but eventually the captive was dragged by force through the corridors again, and pushed into the room. There, the high priest's doctor, who had finally removed his mask, was already waiting for the Great Witch. Bieni was pushed into the room with the doctor. She clearly hadn't expected to see this man here, but the man acted at ease, as if nothing unusual was going on. He had been treating the witch for 6 months now, but judging by her reaction, it was a very ambiguous treatment. And it was strange that he didn't just come to the girl's prison as usual. The doctor said that Mr. Investigator had reported the witch's injured leg, so he wanted to start the treatment first. Bieni was clearly not happy about this, but there was no choice. She obediently walked over and lifted the hem of her shirt, revealing the wound. The man examined the damaged area. Because of the blood and pus, the affected area was poorly visible and under the pretext of washing the wound. The doctor pushed the captive into a barrel of water. Then Pepin roughly pulled the girl's leg out and promised to heal the witch's wounds properly. It sounded ominous, with the words that pain was necessary in the name of healing. The doctor pressed a finger into the wound. Sparks sprang from Bieni's eyes and she screamed. The man paid no attention to these screams and continued talking about how, fearing the magic of the Great Witch, the guards in the prison periodically changed each other, and each time they were annoyed that they couldn't touch her. The doctor blamed the girl herself for this. He squeezed the witch's injured thigh extremely unkindly, running his palm upwards, all the way to the edge of her shirt. Bieni screamed again and kicked her tormentor in the shoulder with her foot. He stiffened and then laughed wildly. He was definitely bewitched by the witch's red eyes. Pim began to lean over her. The captive couldn't help but think that this was all punishment from Maikloth for only half the witches in the place she'd told Stein about last time. Or she was going to be abandoned, thinking she was no longer useful. Diana urgently needed to get out, and she jerked toward the doctor's suitcase, eager to grab some of the tools from there. But the sadistic doctor had no time to do anything significant, nor did he notice the captive's impulse. Maklay kicked him, pulling him away from the girl. He ordered the high priest's confidant to scram. From now on, the treatment of the Great Witch was to take place in the presence of the interrogator every day at 11 in the morning. Pepintoth tried to object, but eventually closed his case of scalpels and withdrew from the room. The witch once again bit her lip painfully. She wondered if the investigator had seen her try to snatch the instrument. Still, the girl had rushed in, trying to find a way out of the situation. However, Meklath was only concerned with the veracity of the rumors about the power of the red eyes. He suspected that they were the ones that had seduced Dr. Pepin, but Beanie denied the presence of any power in her red eyes. And the doctor had attacked her most likely because she was a powerless woman. But the investigator did not back down, clearly not understanding with words. Then the Great Witch rose to her feet and offered the man to check personally on himself the power of her eyes. If some evil force was at work after all, Maya Cloth would sense it. But the man only grinned, deciding that this time the witch was already targeting him. The girl thought bitterly that even after half a year of providing information, this man still didn't believe her one bit. Deannie decided to come at it from a different angle. During the last 6 months of this peculiar cooperation, the investigator himself had looked into the red eyes more than once, but he didn't seem to be bewitched. Or was the man afraid of pouncing on the girl's body at any moment after all? This bold statement enraged the investigator. His opinion was that even God would reject this girl's fallen body, and Pepin knew perfectly well that Maklat would soon enter this room. But still, in spite of that, he lunged at the witch. So there was a good reason. And to establish it, the investigator decided to keep Bieni by his side. Now she will sleep in this room, and during the day to be near the investigator while he is busy working. So the man decided to do so to make sure that the prisoner is not hiding some evil force. It had been 6 months, but they had met less than 10 times, and at least now it was worth keeping the prisoner to himself and finding out for sure. Besides, the high priest would be visiting soon to see the great red-eyed witch. A few days later, already neatly dressed, but still wearing a blindfold, Bieni was led into the study. Maklat was pensively studying the high priest's message. The news that he would visit Rave Fortress to see the great witch had spread quickly. Because of this, the doctor's absurd argument that the prisoner should be washed and cleaned up was accepted. Suddenly, the interrogator slammed the table, causing Bieni to flinch. He ordered her to stand normally. Then the man shifted his gaze to the handcuffs. They were sacred. If a person with magical powers touched a holy relic, they would be hurt. After his remark, Maklat began to ask various questions. Is she the only red-eyed witch, and does she have proof if so? And whether she is definitely a witch at all. If she is definitely a witch at all, if she is so useless and can't even back up her words with something or use any powers? A great witch without powers is absurd. Bieni remained remarkably calm at the provocation. However, Maklat was not impressed, and once again he continued to press her. He had his suspicions that the witch had somehow influenced the high priest's visit, even though she had spent the last 6 months in a dungeon. For example, she might have seduced Dr. Poppin and pulled some trick. To this, Bieni once again replied that she had no such power. The paper shattered as the investigator hit the table again. In a couple of steps, he was beside the girl, and holding up her hands, loomed menacingly over her. The man did not believe the witch, because if she was not lying, then what it... Maklat spoke of the suspicious scars on the girl's body that resembled animal bite marks. They had appeared before the purification of Chiron had begun. Why would something like that be left on the Great Witch's body? Besides, in that forest, they found an interesting record that every season the witches sacrificed a woman. But it doesn't say why. Maybe the Great Witch sacrificed women to control wild beasts. Deani's answer was simple, yet unconvincing. She claimed that witches made sacrifices for nothing. The investigator expectedly did not believe it and only squeezed the captive's face harder with the palm of his hand. He continued to develop his idea that the witch, while saving her life from wild animals in the Tempe Mountains, had learned how to control them. That would explain the scars. And if the captive was unwilling to confess, Maklat was quite willing to do some experimentation. The girl bit down on her bloody lips. The investigator released her face from his palm, backing away from the beast subjugation version. If the Great Witch really knew how to control them, she would not have submitted so easily from the start. The exhausted girl's eyes and lips were red, and it gave off an ominous impression. A match for the Great Witch. The investigator finally let go of the prisoner, and she slumped to the floor without any support. The man nonchalantly ordered water to wash his hands. No sooner had the servant gone to carry out the order, however, than he was rudely pushed away by the priest. He burst in on the investigator with accusations that the man had left the Great Witch at his side, though the priest was not supposed to know that. And the purpose of Maclate's actions, which was to determine the extent of the Great Witch's harmfulness, did not convince the priest. The priest insisted that such things should be investigated in a heavily guarded prison, but not in his private office. The old man's mind could not comprehend how irresponsible one had to be to let such a dangerous thing into his private space. His tirade was interrupted by a servant bringing water. Maclate stepped back to the cup, and the priest continued his exhortation. He insisted on handing the Great Witch over to the servants of the church, since Macleth was unable to appreciate the woman's real danger. The investigator was faintly affected by his words. The high priest had personally ordered him to watch over the prisoner. She could not be tortured or injured in any way, and he did not think the priest could have carried out those instructions. The priest claimed to be able to subdue the devil's power with a single prayer, but in reality that prayer was boiling water, an iron chair, nails, and an iron chair. Nails and an iron, these were their means of purification. And while the men were arguing, Biani became violently ill. The world began to lose its boundaries, to blur. The girl clearly understood what was happening, but she didn't want it. Not here and not now. So she tried to fight to keep her mind clear. Maclate, in the meantime, had put a stop to his conversation with the priest. He advised him to leave the powers of the gods to those who were allowed, and perhaps if they continued to pray diligently, God would give them holy powers, just like Maclate himself, who already has that power. The priest was clearly offended by such remarks, and in a fit of anger, he pushed the bowl of water in which the investigator was washing his hands. The spilled contents of the bowl splashed into Biani's face. She covered her eyes and suddenly collapsed on her side. Maclate rushed to her, and the witch saw a rat in front of her. Biani's life had been a mess. Looking back now, the girl realized that this was the case with both her own mother and her mother's mother. The girl found herself in a place that was unfamiliar to her. She wandered towards an underground passage, and the same rat followed her. Biani needed to wake up, but how? It is unclear. Suddenly, the rat rushed forward. The witch rushed after her until she stumbled and fell down the cliff. Only then the Great Witch opened her eyes. In the room besides her were the investigator and the doctor who had examined Biani's body while she was unconscious. Everything had been fine for a while, no injuries, but Maclate's keen eye had managed to detect blood on the bedclothes. It turned out that the girl's arm was now bleeding. As soon as he saw this, the investigator chased the doctor out the door, leaving him alone with his captive. He had guessed a great deal, and was now expressing his conclusions to her, watching her reactions carefully. If Biani's own words were to be believed, the finger had been bitten by a rat in the cell, and now the crust of the wound had been accidentally peeled off. However, if that was the case, then the bite was already several days old, and it could not physically drain so much blood just because the crust had been peeled off. It turned out that what the witches did to the women meant not only sacrifices, animals were fed blood to control them. Biani, however, was this very woman that the witches offered at every feast. The captive was amazed at how quickly this man had guessed everything, and she had managed to avoid being caught and arousing suspicion in the last 6 months. But now she had to tell everything honestly and in detail, because Maclate would not tolerate lies. This he had clearly demonstrated by blowing up the lamp with sacred power. Stammering, Biani began to explain that the blood did not give control. It was a kind of one-sided obsession. Obsession was an ability that made it possible to briefly utilize the sensations of a blood-fed animal. So Biani didn't know how to control animals, and possession always only happened when she was asleep, so it's a rather unexpected and useless ability. By allowing herself to be bitten by more animals, the girl was trying to increase the chances because she couldn't know in advance at what moment and in which beast her consciousness would end up. However, such a power had nothing to do with seduction. Maclate doubted that, Having the ability to borrow the vision of animals, Bieni had never used it. It was too tempting. Just then, the man changed the subject without much transition, informing him that there was no one in Glad's Valley, and if this tip in the past was not a ruse, the witch had better be told about the new place, and if any of the girl's words turned out to be false. Bieni looked at him fearfully with all her eyes. She felt especially keenly now that if she pushed the investigator away now, it would be the end, certain death on the scaffold in front of the raging crowd. The girl remembered the picture of her own mother strangling her, sincerely wishing for the death of her own daughter. It made everything inside shudder in animal terror. No matter how messy Bieni's life was, she didn't want to die. Not at all. Not at all. Not ever. Anything but death. When Bieni was just a child and entered the cave where the woman was being held, the woman suddenly rushed at her and began to strangle her. She mumbled the word die in a frantic manner. The only thing that saved the child was that the other witches pulled the mother aside. The girl herself was taken outside and the mother's terrifying cry of "You must die" was heard in her back. The witch who dragged Bieni outside forbade her to enter the cave without permission. Then the unfortunate girl realized that someday she too would be locked in there, and she would live a filthy, blood-smelling life. But even if Bieni's life was dirty, she wanted to accept death in the form she wanted. So she told the investigator the next location was Dyron Hill. A devil-worshipping family was located there. The girl could only hope that someone was still hiding there. Mayklat watched the frankly worried witch closely. Without taking his eyes off her, he gave the guard orders to the sergeant to capture and dry all the rats living in the dungeon. A rich carriage belonging to the high priest was traveling along the road. In 10 days, he should have already arrived at Rave Fortress. The carriage was suddenly blocked by the villagers asking for his blessing on their knees. It was unclear how they knew, since the trip had been kept secret, but there was nothing to be done. The high priest was determined to go out to them, even if the delay would delay the journey to the fortress for another week. He could not turn his back on those who needed God, could he? Even though in public, the high priest appeared to be a very mild man with the brightest thoughts. Away from the eyes of others, he looked extremely unhappy with the whole situation. It had been a week since Maklath had gone on his campaign against the witches. Not to Dyron Hill, but to the Glad Valley, to the site of the last tip, off, which had turned out to be a hoax even for Bieni. But the investigator apparently decided to check again. Suddenly, Dr. Poppin entered the room. He had no right to be here, if only because Mayklat had forbidden to enter this room until the end of the military campaign. But the doctor didn't care much about that, for this time he had the support of a taller man. Poppin freed the prisoner's legs from the shackles and announced that they were going for a walk. It was a long walk across a dry field. When they stopped, Bieni saw that the doctor had led her to the edge of a pit, half filled with corpses. Bieni didn't understand why the doctor had brought her to the edge of a pit filled with witches' corpses. Despite Pepin's suspicions, the girl did not think about running away, because it was useless in an empty field anyway. The girl was much more concerned about why there were so many corpses in the pit. Most likely, all the witches would be executed immediately after discovery. One informant is enough for them. There is no need for prisoners. And the girl did not even think about it. Suddenly, the doctor doused the confused Bieni with water with a mixture of medicines that attracted hungry beasts from all around. Around the perimeter, he stationed archers in case of an emergency. The doctor wanted to see how the beasts would react to the Great Witch's fresh blood, and now he'd finally been given permission to do it. He did not specify by whom. Bieni immediately remembered the conversation with Mayaklath. Had he really decided to do his experiment on her after all? The girl broke from her seat and ran. Of course, no animal in this world would do her any significant harm. The animals were just thirsty for the witch's blood, and once they tasted it, they would give up their aggression. She only ran away from them because the prisoner was frightened by the terrible fate of the Great Witch, and the fact that it was being repeated here. As soon as Maklath is convinced of the existence of the power through experimentation, she will try to kill Bieni immediately. In that case, the Great Witch will also be burned at the stake. The beasts finally caught up with the fugitive just as she stumbled and stretched out on the ground. The sharp fangs of the first wolf dug deep into her forearm, causing terrible pain. The second beast was about to attack as well. Bieni had time to think that this was how it would end. Even her death would be this messy. But the second wolf was scorched by blue divine flames. Standing up in defense of the captive was the suddenly appeared in the wasteland, Mayklat. The investigator had questions for the doctor. He had definitely ordered the Great Witch to be locked up. So what was the significance of Poppin's antics? While the beast burned in blue flames, Mayklat waited for the doctor to explain. Poppin had operated on the fact that to test the witch's unholy powers in advance was a direct order from the high priest, whose visit was somewhat delayed. The doctor even had a letter with the order which he had given to the investigator. Mayklat ran his eyes over it. The high priest had gotten involved even faster than he'd thought, but that didn't matter now. The man tore up the letter and burned it, because the rave is his personal fortress and interrogation place for the heretics he rules. It absolutely does not matter who exactly Dr. Poppin was serving. Disobeying Mayklat's orders in his own castle is unacceptable. This time the investigator had simply torn up the letter as punishment, but he would not be so merciful next time. The doctor had only to agree to these terms. Mayklat, on the other hand, roughly lifted Bieni to her feet. After all, they were not damaged, and she could walk safely. So the three of them turned to the fortress, while the wolf who had tasted Bieni's blood roared at them from the thicket. In the evening, the captive was dragged into a room that was unfamiliar to Bieni. There were some papers lying on the floor, which the girl even tried to pick up. At first, it seemed to Bieni that there was no one in the room, but Mayklat quickly revealed his presence. He ordered the witch to come over to him, and the first thing he noticed was the blood seeping through the bandages. Most likely, the bite had bled again due to the chains sometimes being pulled too tight and putting pressure on the unhealed wounds. Mayklat was surprised she was still alive at all, with this frequency of bleeding. The man then demanded an explanation of the appearance of the animal that drank the witch's blood. Bieni hastily explained. There is no need for them to catch the beast, because once they create a bond, it will die. It had always been like that. If it didn't happen, the girl would have already gone crazy because she shared sensations with many beasts. It would seem that why give up her body to be torn apart for such a short-term bond? But there were benefits to it. Bieni could thus anticipate the dangers that would befall the earth. Things like floods, earthquakes, and landslides. Things only beasts could know about. That's where things came into focus for Mayklat. The priests had once pestered him about the extent of the Wicked Witch's powers, since they could avoid even natural disasters. Disasters, according to the clergy, were God's natural judgment, and witches avoided it time after time. I could see why. In any case, Bieni kept saying that there was nothing to worry about, and it would all be over in one night. Mayklat, hearing this, decided to leave the prisoner in his private room. That is, in the room they were in now. Mayklat left the Great Witch in her chambers to keep an eye on her and make sure of the obsession that unknown when and how it would arise during her sleep. He planned to keep the girl by his side for as long as it took for the next response. A full week had passed since then, and the witch had been awake the entire time. Was she trying to avoid being possessed? Either way, the interrogator rarely left her unattended, but that day he left his captive for a couple hours. A man showed up to question a witch caught in Glad's Gorge. The woman claimed that the Great Witch was the only one with true power and that all others were innocent. Only she is capable of responding, that is, experiencing possession, in order to predict the end of the world. The Great Witch is a sacrifice in the name of finding the beast that will trigger the end of the world. Since ancient times, witches have passed down a legend from mouth to mouth. Someday there will be a beast that will lead this world to destruction. And to prevent this, the witch, with the help of her power, must track it down. If the beast does not die after answering the Great Witch's call, it will mean that it is an incarnation of the devil, intertwined with the witch. Once they found the one they were looking for, they would kill the great witch who had bound her soul to that beast. That was their plan to prevent the end of the world. It worked like this. The witches would feed the beasts little by little with Biani's blood, and as soon as a beast appeared that would survive after that, they were going to kill the girl at once. Maeklat did not believe this. He would much more readily believe that the witch had made up these ravings because of a lingering grudge against the Great Witch. Their Great Witch has been captured, unable to find the beast, and will soon be consigned to the flames along with her tribeswomen. So there is no one to stop the end of the world? Maeklat pulled his hands away from the captive and ordered her to be dealt with, for he felt it would be no use. But suddenly, the woman reported the existence of another Great Witch. The Great Witch's essence was passed down by blood, but not too long ago, Biani's mother gave birth to another child. Biani doesn't know about it. The girl's mother herself lost her power long ago and lived only out of duty to leave behind descendants. Maeklat became even more somber and serious. Although Biani's mother is a witch, but she could not get pregnant miraculously by herself. There had to be a father. When the witch told about the father, the investigator was numb with surprise. That's how it turned out.